Good afternoon, everyone. We will start today's webinar in 30 seconds. Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar presented by New Frontier Data. Today, we will be discussing the Cannabis Industry 2.0, the next step up after the historic 2016 election. My name is Gretchen Gailey, Vice President of Communications and Government Affairs at New Frontier Data, and I'll be your moderator. Just a few quick housekeeping items. First, today's event is being recorded and will be made available to you after the webinar. We will send out an email with how to view the on-demand webinar as soon as it is available. Second, please enter your questions using the webinar's on-air control panel, which is located on your screen. You can start entering any questions you may have now. We will get to as many questions as we can on today's webinar. Now let's take a look at the agenda for today's event. First, we'll tell you a little bit about New Frontier Data and Viridian. We will introduce our speakers, and then we will discuss the state of the market. We will then take your questions at the end. First, we begin with Giada DeCarcer, the CEO and founder of New Frontier Data, who will tell us a bit more about New Frontier. Giada.
Thank you, Gretchen. Hello, everyone. Thank you to the hundreds of attendees joining us today. Interestingly, not only across the US, but from quite a few countries around the world. So a true testament to the pivotal point the cannabis industry is in today. I am the CEO and founder of New Frontier Data, a leading data and analytics provider in the cannabis industry. In terms of what we do, to keep it very brief, we collect millions of data points per second covering every aspect of the industry, and then deliver them in the form of market reports, customized studies, and via our online real-time interactive portal, Equio. We strive to help investors identify opportunities in the space, assess potential risks, and ways to mitigate such risks, but ultimately to determine target returns. We also support cannabis businesses. We help them increase their profitability and optimize their overall operations by helping them align their products and services with actual demand. So with indeed customers willing and able to purchase their products and services. As far as a very brief background on myself, I'm a recovering investment banker. I spent about a decade or so working in data analysis and collection with JP Chase in New York and London, and also spent quite a bit of time with the US government and Fortune 100 companies in focusing on technology and energy. I created solutions you may know best as today's Progressive Snapshot and Verizon's Hum. My expertise during the past 20 years has ultimately been in rigorously collecting and digesting data across complex market and turning that data into easily digestible and actionable intelligence, impacting the bottom line of those needing it. It is an absolute pleasure to be partnered and collaborating with Viridian Capital Partners on this very timely report. And I very much look forward to your questions at the end of this webinar. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Giada. Next, we have Sam Osborne, the Vice President of Product for New Frontier, who was the lead author on today's brief. Sam?
Thank you, Gretchen, and pleasure to be speaking with everybody on the line today. It's an exciting time for the cannabis industry. Just in terms of my background, I come from thinking about how emerging markets need to be understood, nuances, and how capital markets activity can really illustrate how these markets are evolving at a rapid pace. In order to get things going quickly, I'd like to jump into the material, but first an intro with Scott Greiper.
Well, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Giada. Thank you, Gretchen. Exciting to be with everybody today and partnered with our friends at New Frontier. We are also about data. Unfortunately, Giada, I am also a recovering investment banker, but I'm still an investment banker, so I haven't fully recovered from that. We launched Viridian Capital Advisors about 2.5 years ago as one of the first Wall Street licensed practices that was offering investment banking, capital market services, and strategic advisory services to the emerging cannabis industry. I come from a 30-year career on Wall Street, working for small and large firms, and I've always focused on helping to back and build emerging growth technology companies. The fit with New Frontier on today's webinar is New Frontier's very deep dive into the data of consumption and supply and demand, matching Viridian's data on tracking the flow of capital that's come into the cannabis market over the last several years. We've now tracked close to $2.5 billion worth of transactions, knowing the investor, the sector that the capital has come into, and the specific terms and valuation over that money. And we'll discuss a little bit of all the underlying intelligence that's coming out of this data collection. So looking forward to getting started.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. Now, before we jump into the meat of our presentation today, we'd like to ask you a quick poll question. What is your biggest area of need regarding investing into the cannabis industry? A, clarifying risk premiums associated with direct investment. B, finding relevant market data for conducting due diligence. C, identifying appropriate partners and/or channels for deploying additional capital. Or D, comparing and benchmarking equity valuations to analyze market opportunity. We'll give you a few seconds here to compile your answers. We'll get back to you at the end of the webinar with the answers that we received from you all with those results. Now, thank you for letting us know your interest in cannabis investing. Let's jump into the findings. Sam?
Thank you, Gretchen. So Scott mentioned something really important, and what it is the marriage of the industry data that New Frontier provides, discrete market activity and capital markets data that's supplied by Viridian Capital Advisors. And what this allows us to do, lens at what is both driving the opportunity in cannabis, but also how are the market conditions illustrating how that opportunity is changing. And obviously regarding this presentation today, it's in the context of the US 2016 elections. We saw a number of states through ballot initiatives, either medicinal or adult use cannabis, which is ultimately the primary driving force between all of the related throughput effects that opportunity is showing. And that's what's drawing investor interest. When we look at cannabis markets at a macro level, adult use markets in 2020 are going to include not only some of the recent markets such as Oregon, Colorado, and Washington that have legalized, but also California, which is poised to be the epicenter, again, of cannabis market opportunity, Massachusetts, which is a potential beachhead in the Northeast for legally regulated adult use marketplace, and the implications are very far-reaching. So when we think about the 2016 US election, we have understood that overall projections, when we're thinking about opportunity here, percent larger than if these states had not legalized. So what we're seeing, again, is this trend of popular support across bipartisan pathways, gender, education levels, ethnicity. The idea of legalized cannabis now is driving down the risk premiums previously associated with this often stigmatized gray market. When we think about now the leading indicators, not just the current investment climate, but the leading indicators that are going to continue to drive opportunity online, overall popular approval combined to create this easily palatable initiative level that says people want it, people believe in it, the efficacy is growing, and the validity is growing. This is why we think about, okay, the context of the macro opportunity for cannabis is ripe for investor interest. A segue into how that investor interest has actually manifested in the marketplace.
Thank you, Sam. This is Scott. So a couple of things we're going to go through here. We're going to go through the performance of the Viridian Cannabis Stock Index, which we've been maintaining for the last 2.5 years. This index tracks approximately 50 of the public cannabis companies out of the more than 300 around the world. There are US companies in this index, Canadian, and a few Israeli and Australian companies. The way we choose the 50 companies is we have very, very basic metrics that have to be passed. And these are quite basic, which shows you the nascent stage of this industry. At least a $5 million market cap, at least 15% of the outstanding shares in the float, and the company has had to have filed a K or a Q in the prior 6 months. So it doesn't make them a current filer, but when you consider that almost 65% of public companies are late filers in this industry, it really shows you that we've got a long way to go to mature. In any event, the performance of the index has been quite strong, and particularly so this year. Year to date, we're up about 190%. This is through last Friday. And there's a couple of interesting market intelligence that comes out of the data. Number one, we categorize the performance in the companies across 12 different industry sectors, what we believe are the core product buckets that comprise the cannabis industry. This is from ag tech to biotech, from cultivation to real estate. And we then segregate them into companies that touch the plant, biotech, cultivation, and hemp, and companies that don't touch the plant, the ancillary service providers. When we entered this market almost 3 years ago, it was almost verboten as an investor, or certainly a public company, to be touching the plant because it's federally illegal. Well, so far this year, the companies in the index that touch the plant have gained over 290%. The companies in the index that are the ancillary service providers are up 85%. So we're starting to see that line of demarcation between touching the plant and not begin to dissolve, which reflects a greater risk tolerance on the part of investors. One more point to make about the index. The top performing sectors, the top is biotech and pharma, which continues to support the fact that perhaps the highest value of all of this advocacy and legal change and legislative change for legal cannabis is medicine. Not only providing access to medicine for those folks that need it, and fortunately those folks that live in legal states, but ultimately the pharmaceuticalization of the industry, where there's true R&D, true drug development, true clinical trials, and ultimately when cannabis is descheduled and the industry comes out under the supervision of the FDA, we are going to have pharmaceutical products in cannabis. So biotech is still the best performer in our index. It's been that way since we started. Second best performing sector is cultivation and retail. And again, what we're seeing here is really the origin of all of the business activity in cannabis starts with the growing of the plant. When we started in this industry a few years ago, and I would go out to visit grows in Colorado, a large grow was 30 or 40,000 square feet. Today you can go to Colorado and there are grows that are 250 and 300,000 square feet. So like any commodity, size matters, economies of scale matters, cost of production matters. So smarter money is coming in behind the grows in what they ultimately consider as a real estate play, in adopting and deploying advanced technologies, advanced grow systems because as the wholesale price of cannabis continues to come down, and it's reduced by about 40% over the last year, it's going to get destroyed. And economies of scale matter. So I can go into some more detail on that, but in the interest of everybody's time, I think that's where I'll finish up on the overview of the Viridian Cannabis Stock Index.
Okay, great. Thank you, Sam and Scott. Now let's open it up to some questions. The first question I have goes to Scott. What do you see as the biggest risk to cannabis industry growth?
Well, I would say in a normal market environment, meaning a national market that doesn't have legality issues, the biggest challenge to any nascent market is capital. Independent of management skill, independent of technology development, small companies are perpetually cash starved. So a market like ours in the cannabis industry, up to about a year ago, was facing this situation. Capital was the biggest impediment to growth. That's not the case anymore, as you could see by our cannabis deal tracker, where there's been about $1 billion of capital that's coming into the industry. So I would say in a normal environment, it would be capital. I think in this environment, and I'm taking Jeff Sessions out of the equation here, but I think in this environment of where we are in the cannabis industry, having professional management teams operating cannabis businesses that have experience founding and scaling and funding and exiting early stage businesses is the biggest challenge to growth.
Okay, thank you, Scott. The next question we have here goes to Sam. Which market or market segments do you think will receive the most investment in 2017?
I think Scott touched on it a little bit. Obviously, biotech, medicinal applications, the ability to obviously continue to grow along the market. I think California, investor interest there is obviously a hotbed. I think the adult use legalization initiative has opened up a number of new nodes as you think about California transitioning into adult use, which may obviously take some time to become fully operational. 2018, we're talking about the biggest legal cannabis market in the nation. And so as far as the US goes, it's California to a degree because of the geographic implications of being along the Northeast corridor. Conversations, and I'm sure Scott can attest as well, center around Canada. It's a lot more clear from federal guidelines and policies that allow investors to reduce their risk premium, the public markets accessing liquidity through the Canadian basically ability and opening up has allowed a lot of these public companies to flourish. So when you're thinking about investment from a potential institutional level, we see Canada as a very big market that's underwriting a lot of the opportunity because of the federal legality and clarity. And so that obviously begs the question of the United States when we see this impending momentum in cannabis legalization's favor late to the new administration's objectives and clarity stemming from the legality at a federal level in the United States. That will ideally a lot of the uncertainty around future development, and investors from institutional and multinational firms and investment companies will feel much more comfortable to continue to dip their toes in and make full-fledged direct investments into the industry.
Okay, Sam, I want to touch on something you just said there, and we're getting a lot of questions from folks on the same topic, and I'll throw that out to both of you when you talk about the impending legalization. How does a Trump administration, and more specifically his pick of anti-cannabis Attorney General Jeff Sessions, potentially impact federal enforcement of laws on the books versus state laws? And just overall, what are your thoughts on our new AG pick? Sam or Scott? Who wants to
Yeah, Gretchen, I'll jump in here.
Okay.
I guess nothing really moves on a straight line. and certainly not the rollout of an industry that's been illegal for decades. And so while November 8th was a true tipping point, and as New Frontier and we are calling it version 2 of the industry with 8 new states, the appointment of Sessions has cast a pall over the industry, and there's probably not a half a day that goes by where I'm not answering the question as to whether the risk profile of the industry has changed because of that appointment. I think it has. But if you look back, for what it's worth, to the 12 or 13 interviews that Mr. Trump gave during the primary and presidential election cycle when he was asked about legalization of marijuana, he gave an amazingly consistent response, which was, we believe in states' rights. We're the Republican Party. We're a party of smaller federal government, pushing decisions down to the state level. So we're all holding our hope on that exact response, because that's what the Supreme Court ruled last year, that cannabis legalization is a state issue. It's not a federal issue. And he also said that he knows people in his inner circle that are users of medicinal marijuana and have benefited from medicinal marijuana. So whether his AG appointment overturns that thinking, that's certainly possible. But I certainly don't think within a Republican administration they're going to move away from a states' rights mandate. It's a core platform of that party.
Okay, thank you very much, Scott. Our next question goes to institutional firms. Sam, how would institutional firms entering the space actually impact investment opportunities overall?
So that's a great question. I'd like to split it into 2 answers. And one is the institutional investors, thinking of private equity firms, venture capital, a lot of investment banks, et cetera. And the other is multinational companies. So we start to see, whether it's Scott's Miracle-Gro, whether it's big alcohol, big tobacco, starting to think about this cannabis opportunity. So ultimately, access to liquidity and capital, as Scott mentioned, will be a boon for overall investment opportunity and the industry growth. That new level and tier of investment, competition and consolidation in all likelihood accelerate. And I agree with Scott's points completely about the AG pick. Ultimately, we're not going to put the genie back into the bottle. Cannabis legalization is happening at a state level, and they don't have the political capital to fight states and try to roll back all of these initiatives. Comes the question of what happens when we get large multinational firms and their war chests deciding to enter the space. So it ultimately is going to increase the pace of M&A that Viridian Capital Advisors has already been tracking. We understand that these companies are going to have to create moats to insulate themselves from increasing competition that has much more experience, more well-funded, and frankly has the ability to direct a lot of investment in a very short period of time into entering the space, whether that's through acquisitions, which is primarily going to be the mechanism, less so of a greenfield approach. Both sides of the equation is obviously going to increase the amount of liquidity around the industry, but what that actually means depends on whether you're operating in the space or whether you're thinking about it purely from the investment perspective. And it's going to happen either way. So it behooves all of those paying close attention and thinking about how are you going to prepare for both the risk and opportunity associated with institutional involvement.
Okay.
Gretchen, can I jump in here with a thought on that question?
Yes, of course. Mm-hmm. Please.
So since the beginning of 2015, we in the industry have witnessed an accelerating level of participation on the part of, I'll call it professional investors. You could label it institutional, whether they're small family offices, dedicated private equity cannabis funds, portfolio managers of large funds, they're coming in. And it's a good thing, and it's a needed thing. All investors chase growth and invest in growth. Professional investors also chase and invest growth, but on a risk-adjusted basis. So an experienced investment class coming in is benefiting the industry in a couple of different ways. Most importantly, smart money is not easy money for small companies because it comes with certain controls and mandates. But on the whole, it's positive because they're forcing early stage companies to develop real governance on the board level. They're forcing early stage companies to develop better budgeting and forecasting models. They're forcing early stage companies to develop better financial controls. Generally speaking, better operating integrity and better execution. It's an Achilles heel for this industry. It has been for some time. There's a lot of great domain knowledge in this industry. There's a lot of great, strong advocates in this industry. We need more seasoned executives with a track record. That's what professional capital in this industry brings with it. In 2014, only about 8% of all the capital raises done was funded by a professional investor or investor group, VC or PE. Last year, that number was about 18%. This year, we think it's going to exceed 25 or 30%. So the bloom's off the rose a little bit. And despite the fact that Schedule I and federal illegality is keeping the institutional market out of this in the main, and it is, more and more of the smaller professional capital is coming in, and we're seeing portfolio managers at large funds, which are not touching this sector because of Schedule I, investing on their own. So it's a trend that's just going to continue to accelerate, and we believe it's a positive trend for the industry.
Okay, thank you, Scott. And I guess coming off of that question a bit more, is it better to invest in private or public cannabis companies? Scott?
Well, I don't know if it's an either or. Public companies, for an investor, offer the hope or the visibility to liquidity, right? That's why public companies become public companies, because they have a liquid stock. It's easy to raise capital because investors can get out. But public companies also typically, I shouldn't say typically, in the case of fast-growing early stage verticals like the cannabis marketplace, tend to have higher valuations, and I would say in many cases unsubstantiated valuations. So the entry point, the price point can be higher. The positive factors being you can get out, although a lot of public cannabis companies don't have good trading characteristics. And the public companies do have a currency to use for acquisition. So the benefits of investing in a public company is really liquidity and disclosure, because public companies have to file Ks and Qs. The benefits of investing in a private company are it's a more closely held company. You're not dealing with 2,000 investors. You're typically getting in at a lower price point. You might be able to have more control if you're a larger investor that wants to have not a majority stake, but some control stake. That's all available in a private market company. So I don't really believe it's either or in this industry. I think it's just what type of investor you are.
Okay. Sam, I have a question here for you. How has the cost of carrying cannabis investing changed post-election?
So that's an interesting question. And about cannabis as a commodity, I don't think it's quite commoditized yet. Obviously, there's a lot of structural elements and protocols in place that need to be in place before we can consider it a true commodity. But we do have to understand how the risk premium has changed. And this is really what we've been highlighting all call today, which is we think about, the cost of carry. we probably think that the risk premiums are going down. There's going to be more liquidity. We see, as Scott mentioned, more professional investors coming into the space is going to point an opportunity here to think about how your investment timelines are changing. And I think this is the point Scott was emphasizing, is as an investor, you have to understand what your both risk premiums are and timelines on your use of capital is. I mean, if you want to be a money market fund versus cannabis investing, you need to be able to identify why you believe the risk premiums are what they are. And I think the US election is an easy one to point to. You think about it from an investor perspective, if you invest in a private company, obviously you might be able to achieve more attractive valuations and multiples from your perspective than if in a public investing. But like Scott said, there's not much liquidity for a marketplace to be able to exit quickly. Ultimately, all of these variables are changing simultaneously, and being able to how you think about your return in the context of risk is ultimately both what Viridian and New Frontier specialize in within the cannabis industry.
Gretchen, can I jump in on that question as well? Gretchen, you out there?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Are you able to bring up the two slides in the deck, one on the M&A transactions this year, and then on the capital raise transactions this year, just to go over those to answer this question?
Yes.
Yep, we're looking at it now, Scott.
Okay. So, yep, there it was. All right, I don't know if I'm seeing it, guys, but you have the M&A chart up?
We do.
Okay. So, first off, the risk premium does not affect the industry as a whole, or I should say similarly. The risk premium really is very sector specific. The biotech risk premium deals with how long it's going to take and how much money it's going to take, and in what FDA environment are people going to develop drugs. The cultivation risk premium is, are you going to have a cost of production that allow you to compete in a reducing wholesale price environment? So it's very specific to the sector. But the answer to me is always in what's happening on the ground. And if you look at the M&A chart, and this is what the Cannabis Deal Tracker illuminates, almost a third of all of the M&A transactions done this year to date happened in the last 7 or 8 weeks, leading up to the election and now through the election. So even with the, I guess I'll call it a threat of Sessions coming out in AG, cannabis companies have not been afraid to devote a significant part of their balance sheet to making acquisitions to improve their breadth and scale of operations. So kind of the proof is in the pudding of that. And guys, if you could put up the next slide there, the capital raise component of the Viridian Cannabis Deal Tracker.
We're looking at it.
Okay. You're seeing a similar trend. You know, in the last couple of weeks, we've tracked about $120 million worth of deals, almost $110 million just last week. So five deals announced, about $110 million in total aggregating capital raises, almost $22 million of average deal size. Last year at this point in time, the average deal size was $645,000. So independent of the AG, capital is coming into the industry at an accelerating level, both in terms of frequency of transaction and average deal size. And we're seeing a similar effect on the M&A side. So investors and smart investors are pricing transactions differently across the 12 different sectors of the industry. If anybody wants to find out more about that, we'd be happy to speak to people. What we're not seeing any effect on is the pace and frequency of investment capital coming into the industry.
Okay. It appears we only have time for one more question, and it's everyone's favorite question. When will marijuana be descheduled or made federally legal in the U.S.? Who wants to take that one?
Is Mr. Sessions on the call?
Not that I know of.
Okay. Thought I'd throw that to him. Sam, why don't you go ahead?
It's obviously a prognostication, and Sessions not being here, nobody has a crystal ball. I think it's seemingly inevitable with the momentum behind it that it becomes an pressing issue for the federal government to address. When we start looking out to 2020, size of the industry and the magnitude of the economic linkages sectors across the whole, not just US economy, but global economy, come that white elephant in the room to a degree that is just sort of sitting there waiting for policy clarity. So what we have now, a policy clarity, but no real federal ruling dictating how cannabis legalization would look. I think as a timeline goes, we look at the Trump administration with Sessions nomination not necessarily being conducive. So when you think about possibly 8 to 10 years out, overall operationalization legal program would obviously take some time. I think that's generally the timeline that people are evaluating. Anything too much further than 10 years out from now, you're talking, billions and billions and billions of dollars into the industry that's quote unquote technically. So I think the institutional level involvement that we've already discussed, both from professional investors and multinationals, will continue to help push the issue and bubble it up to the federal level, whether it is through lobbying and advocacy or just having sort of money talk in the sense of the economic impacts it could bring. I think that's a fair, relatively conservative estimate to think about the federal government beginning to tackle this issue. But Scott, you might feel differently.
No, I think we're in sync on this, Sam. I think the level of priority and importance in a Trump administration of legalizing cannabis is somewhere buried in the basement of Trump Tower on 56th and 5th. I just don't think it's going to have any attention or priority at all. And let's hope that's the worst of it. I certainly, and I think we at Viridian and our network as a whole, are not expecting any move on Schedule 1 at all during this administration. I had a lunch with somebody today who's quite confident that Obama's last stroke of the pen is going to be to deschedule before he leaves office. Who knows? I will tell you that I think for us that are in this industry now, New Frontier, Viridian, folks on this call, it's not a bad thing to be in this very gray area between state legalization progress and Schedule 1 at the federal level. Keeping the institutional large players out of the market does provide opportunity for firms like ourselves to become what we've become and have some runway to develop really institutionally valuable practices. It obviously has not stopped the flow of capital in the industry. It obviously has not stopped the performance of public companies in the industry. So I just don't think anybody knows, but certainly I'm not banking on any change at the federal level in a Trump administration.
All right. Thank you, gentlemen, for both of your insights today. Before we conclude this webinar, we want to go back to our poll question and let you know the results of it. The question was, what is your biggest area of need regarding investing into the cannabis industry? And the winner is B, finding relevant market data for conducting due diligence. And that's closely followed by D, comparing and benchmarking equity valuations to analyze market opportunity. As a reminder, once again, thank you for everyone who joined us today. You will be receiving a recording of this webinar later this week. If you are interested in learning more about New Frontier Data, go to our website at www.newfrontierdata.com. Or if you would like to know more about Viridian Capital Advisors, you can check out their site at www.viridianca.com. Have a wonderful evening.